The world tells you a lot of things. It shouts about success, screams about ambition, whispers sweet nothings about glory and gold. It shows you shiny pictures, big houses, fast cars, and people with names etched into marble. It tells you that if you just push harder, climb higher, grab more then, and only then will you be truly rich, truly happy. And most of us, we listen. We nod our heads, we tighten our belts, and we run. We run until our lungs burn, our feet ache, and our hearts feel like empty drums echoing in a hollow chest. We chase the horizon, thinking the sun is just beyond the next ridge, only to find another ridge and another, and the sun still out of reach. We sacrifice sleep, peace, sometimes even the quiet laughter of those we swore we were doing it all for. We forget to look down at our own 2 feet, forget to notice the soil beneath them, forget to feel the warmth of a hand in ours. We confuse a full bank account with a full life. And then one day, if we're lucky, the running stops, or something stops us. And in that stillness, in the sudden, jarring quiet, we might just start to hear a different kind of truth. A truth whispered not by the world, but by something much older, much wiser, deep inside us. It's a truth that says the real treasure isn't found at the top of a mountain, but sometimes, right there in the valley, in the ordinary dust of an extraordinary life. There was a man like that. His name was Lester. He was 48 years old, and he worked in a factory. Not one of those gleaming robotic palaces you see in commercials, but a place that smelled of hydraulic fluid and hot metal, where the clang of machinery was the constant soundtrack to every day. Lester was one of the men on the line, assembling industrial pumps, a steady, repetitive rhythm of nuts, bolts, and heavy lifting that had etched itself into the very marrow of his bones. If you saw Lester walking down the street, you wouldn't necessarily give him a second glance. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear designer clothes or drive a car that turned heads. He just moved, deliberate and unhurried, like a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. But if you took that second glance, if you actually looked at him, you'd see a story etched into his face, a roadmap of hard days and quiet triumphs. His eyes, set deep beneath a brow perpetually furrowed from concentration, held a peculiar blend of weariness and warmth. They were the eyes of an observer, missing nothing, taking it all in but never giving too much away. They could appear gruff to a stranger or reserved, but if you caught them in the right light, especially when he was listening intently to someone, you'd see a deep, almost luminous empathy flicker there. His hands were a testament to his life. Not soft, executive hands that shuffled papers and pressed elevator buttons, but strong, calloused working man's hands. The knuckles were a little swollen, the skin rough, scarred in a couple of places from minor scrapes with unforgiving machinery. These were hands that had built things, fixed things, provided for a family. They were the kind of hands that could tighten a bolt with surprising precision or gently steady a trembling child. Lester wasn't much for idle chatter. When he spoke, it was deliberate, measured, like he weighed each word on a mental scale before letting it go. Sometimes a dry, understated wit would surface, a quick observation that would catch you off guard and leave a quiet smile on your face. He moved with a quiet, dependable strength, a man rooted to the earth, unshakable. He wasn't the loudest voice in the break room, rarely offered unsolicited advice, but when he did speak, people generally stopped to listen. There was a wisdom in his silence, a sense that he'd seen enough of the world to know what truly mattered and what didn't. He carried himself not with the swagger of a man who thought he knew it all, but with the quiet dignity of a man who knew enough. He had seen a lot of hard days, sure you could tell that much from the lines around his mouth, the faint shadow under his eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to banish entirely. But there was still a reason to smile there, a faint, almost imperceptible upturn at the corners of his lips when he thought no one was watching. It was a smile that spoke of an inner peace, hard-won and deeply cherished. It wasn't the easy grin of a man who'd never faced a storm. It was the settled calm of a man who'd sailed through tempests and finally found his harbor. Beneath that quiet strength, a careful observer might detect a ghost of something else, a deep, thoughtful current, perhaps a subtle hint of regret for roads not taken, or more accurately, for roads once furiously pursued and then deliberately abandoned. But even that was now just a whisper, overshadowed by the profound sense of purpose that glowed, steady and low, from within. He was Lester, a factory worker, and if you watched him long enough, you'd realize he wasn't just assembling pumps. He was assembling a life, piece by quiet piece, that felt to him richer than any fortune. Every morning, before the world outside decided it was ready to face the day, Lester was already up. His alarm, a no-nonsense digital clock on the bedside table, chirped its insistent, tinny tune at precisely 5:00 a.m. No snooze button for Lester. That was a luxury for people who had the luxury of choice or the illusion of it. He'd swing his feet to the worn rug, the carpet fibers familiar beneath his soles, and the first sip of the day's quiet peace would begin. The house, small and lived in, smelled of old wood, last night's faint dinner, and the promise of fresh coffee. He moved through it with the practiced grace of a man who knew every creak in the floorboards, every shadow cast by the pre-dawn light. Sarah, his wife, would still be asleep, a soft hump beneath the quilt, and he'd pause just for a moment to watch the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. 25 years, and that sight still settled something deep inside him. He'd make his coffee, black and strong, the old percolator gurgling its morning song, a counterpoint to the distant rumble of the city waking up. Then he'd sit at the kitchen table, the wood scarred with years of breakfasts and homework sessions, and just be. Read a page from the worn paperback he kept there, or simply stare out the window at the neighbor's lone oak tree, its branches skeletal against the brightening sky. It was a ritual, this quiet start, his anchor against the rising tide of the day. Then came the factory. Same route, 5 days a week, a landscape of tired storefronts and fading murals. The plant itself was a cavernous beast of concrete and corrugated steel, smelling of oil, metal, dust, and the faint, sweet tang of burnt circuitry. Lester worked the assembly line, fitting valves onto industrial pumps. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't challenging, not in the way he once craved. It was repetitive, precise, and physically demanding. Hour after hour, his hands, calloused and strong, performed the same motions, tightening bolts, checking gauges, guiding the next component into place. The clang and hum of machinery was a constant companion, a symphony of industry that most people learned to tune out. But Lester, with his observant nature, often found himself listening not to the noise, but to the rhythm beneath it, the steady pulse of production, of things being made, of purpose being served. The money wasn't what it used to be, not by a long shot. The paychecks were dependable enough to keep the lights on, the fridge stocked, and contribute to Emily's nursing school loans and Michael's college tuition. But there was always that careful calculus at the kitchen table with Sarah, the balancing act of utility bills and unexpected car repairs, the small sacrifices here and there. They didn't go on lavish vacations. Their biggest luxury was a quiet weekend at the state park. Life was a constant negotiation with numbers, a perpetual reminder of the path he'd chosen, or rather, the path he'd left. Sometimes, during the long stretches on the line, when his mind was free to wander, a ghost of another life would flicker at the edges of his vision. He'd see himself in a sharp suit, in an air-conditioned office high above the city, the hum of servers replacing the roar of machinery. He'd hear the confident clip of his own voice, the measured arguments in a boardroom, the clink of expensive coffee mugs. He used to be that man, a junior executive, relentlessly ambitious, driven by the siren call of immense wealth and widespread recognition. He'd been good at it, too, ruthlessly efficient, climbing the corporate ladder with a singular, almost terrifying focus. The memory of that Lester, the one with the hungry eyes and the perpetually tight jaw, was a shadow that still sometimes fell across the quiet, dependable man he was now. He carried a hidden regret about that past ambition, not for what he'd missed out on, but for what he'd almost become. He'd been so close to a monumental promotion, a corner office, a salary that would make his current factory wage look like pocket change. And he remembered the emptiness, the gnawing dissatisfaction that had begun to hollow him out even as his star rose. He'd neglected his family then, the gentle nudges from Sarah dismissed as distractions, the children's eager stories cut short by the insistent vibrate of his phone. He'd been chasing a phantom, a definition of success that had nothing to do with genuine connection, with the quiet satisfaction of a life well-lived. That former self, that driven, almost ruthless corporate climber, was his most persistent inner demon. He didn't hate that man, not exactly. But he was overly critical of him, of the blindness, the single-minded pursuit of something he now knew was fool's gold. He often wondered if he'd ever truly made amends, if the peace he felt now was earned, or merely a surrender. He yearned for genuine connection and impact, and sometimes the quiet hum of the factory floor felt like a penance, a daily reminder of a different kind of ambition he once held. The gap between that high-flying executive and the man tightening bolts on the assembly line could sometimes feel vast, a canyon he had crossed, but whose echoes still reached him on the quietest nights. The 5 a.m. alarm was a blunt instrument, a metallic screech that tore through the comfortable dark. Lester didn't fight it anymore. He'd learned to move before his mind fully caught up, a well-oiled machine of habit forged over years. The floorboards groaned a familiar tune as he padded to the bathroom, the quiet house still breathing with the soft snores of Sarah, warm beneath the covers. He shaved in silence, the steam from the shower doing little to loosen the knots in his shoulders. Every morning the mirror showed him the same face. Lines etched deep around the eyes from too much worry and too many smiles, a faint stubble, and the quiet resolve of a man who knew what he had to do. A percolator gurgled on the counter, filling the small kitchen with the earthy scent of dark roast. He drank it black, staring out the window at the pre-dawn gray, the streetlights still fighting a losing battle against the approaching sun. He packed his lunch, usually a turkey sandwich, an apple, maybe a handful of pretzels. Nothing fancy. The budget for groceries was a constant, low thrum beneath everything, a subtle reminder that while peace had a price, so did responsibility. Bills for Emily's nursing school loan, Michael's college books, the ever-present hum of the house payment. They were always there, a stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter, demanding attention, demanding his labor. His old Ford F-150, a reliable beast with too many miles and a rattling exhaust, rumbled to life in the driveway. The drive to the plant was a blur of familiar turns, past sleeping houses and the occasional early riser jogger. The sky lightened slowly, bleeding from bruised purple to an anemic pink, painting the sky with the same hues of exhaustion he felt in his bones. He pulled into the employee lot, already half full, a concrete expanse ringed by chain-link fence, the hulking metal shell of the factory silhouetted against the rising sun, a monument to industry, to the relentless grind. He nodded to a few familiar faces as he walked past the security booth, the smell of grease and hot metal already assaulting his nostrils even before he pushed through the heavy double doors. Inside, the world became a symphony of industrial clamor. The insistent clang of presses, the high-pitched whine of grinders, the hiss of pneumatic tools. Lester moved to his station on the assembly line, a section dedicated to the production of heavy-duty truck axles. His job was to tighten bolts, thousands of them a day, with a pneumatic wrench that throbbed in his hands, transmitting its vibration deep into his forearms. Click-whir-thunk, repeat, click-whir-thunk, repeat, hour after hour. His mind would drift, a small escape hatch opening in the monotony. He'd catch himself remembering the hushed carpeted offices of his past, the quiet hum of a high-end air conditioner, the intellectual challenge of a complex spreadsheet, the mental gymnastics of a negotiation. Here, the challenge was physical endurance, the rhythm dictated by the belt, by the relentless march of time. Sometimes, a jolt of that old ambition would flicker, a ghost in the machine. He'd see a younger coworker, hungry-eyed, talking about starting his own business, and a pang of something unidentifiable, not envy exactly, but a deep, buried resonance would hit him. He'd quickly push it down. That ambition had nearly cost him everything. Yet the quiet hum of his current life, while peaceful, sometimes felt too small, too safe. Was he hiding? Was this profound contentment just a sophisticated form of surrender? He'd once chased the biggest fish in the biggest pond, and now he was content with the quiet stream. The self-doubt, his most persistent inner demon, would whisper, "Are you truly making an impact, Lester, or just avoiding the fight?" He knew the answer intellectually was in the family he nurtured, the volunteer hours he put in, the small kindnesses he offered. But the ghost of the man who almost had it all, the one who saw wealth in corner offices and stock portfolios, still occasionally haunted his quieter moments, casting a long shadow over the simple pride he felt in a day's honest work. He'd look at his calloused hands, hands that once manipulated keyboards and signed contracts, now stained with grease, and wonder if they were doing enough good, if this was truly the peak of his purpose. The yearning for genuine connection and impact, that deep-seated desire, sometimes felt like a hunger that the repetitive work of the factory floor, while honorable, couldn't quite satisfy. He yearned to contribute more, to leave a mark beyond the perfectly tightened bolts that rolled past his station. Lunch break was a brief respite, a blur of half-eaten sandwiches and mumbled conversation in the break room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and the distant clatter of machinery. He'd sit observing the younger guys, their energy still bright, their futures unwritten. He saw in them the fire he once had, and the quiet voice inside would ask, "Did you burn out, Lester? Or did you just learn to stoke a different kind of fire?" The afternoon shift was the hardest, the body growing heavy, the mind sluggish. The clock on the wall became a cruel, slow-moving enemy, each minute an eternity, each hour a mountain to climb. The physical exhaustion was a blanket, heavy and suffocating, but it was honest. It was a tangible proof of his contribution, a penance perhaps for the years he'd spent in air-conditioned comfort, earning a fortune while feeling poorer than he ever had. When the final whistle blew, a welcome shriek that cut through the factory din, Lester felt a profound, weary satisfaction. He clocked out, the click of the time card a small victory. The drive home was usually quieter, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, a stark contrast to the drab grays of the morning. He pulled into his driveway, the old house welcoming, a warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen window. Sarah would be there, her steady presence a balm to his tired soul. They'd eat dinner, simple fare, and discuss the day, Emily's latest triumph as a nurse, Michael's struggles with a challenging class. He'd help with the dishes, then settle onto the worn couch, the bills still peeking from their envelopes on the coffee table, a constant reminder of the fine line they walked. He was content, yes, richer in spirit than he'd ever been, but the world still demanded its due, and he still carried the ghost of a question. Is this truly enough? Am I making the difference I was put here to make, or merely existing in comfortable quiet? The gap between the high-flying executive and the man tightening bolts on the assembly line, that canyon he had crossed, still echoed sometimes, a distant, lonely call in the quietest hours of his working-class home. The gap between the high-flying executive and the man tightening bolts on the assembly line, that canyon he had crossed, still echoed sometimes, a distant, lonely call in the quietest hours of his working-class home. But there was a time, not so long ago, when that quiet contentment felt like a distant planet, an unachievable luxury. He wore expensive suits then, each thread a testament to his ambition, his tireless drive. Lester, the corporate rising star, the man who knew how to close a deal and charm a room. He was 38, relentless, a junior executive in a firm that rewarded ruthlessness and 20-hour days. His calendar was a war zone, every minute barricaded with meetings, flights, strategy sessions. Fortune and fame weren't just abstract concepts. They were the air he breathed, the fuel that kept him running on empty. He was on the cusp of the biggest promotion of his career, a move that would rocket him into the C-suite, complete with a monstrous salary, a company car, and all the accolades a man could want. He had everything on paper, everything the world told him he should crave. Yet inside, a growing emptiness gnawed at him, a cold spot where his soul used to hum. Sarah and the kids felt like appointments he penciled in, often erased for more pressing matters. Their laughter, once the sweetest sound, became a distant melody, background noise to the insistent clatter of his own ambition. He was there, but he wasn't there. The crack didn't start with a bang, but with a shudder. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. He was presenting a quarterly report, numbers flashing across a projector screen, his voice smooth, confident, utterly devoid of genuine feeling. Suddenly, the words blurred. The room tilted. A dull ache in his chest sharpened into a searing knife. He felt the blood drain from his face, the air sucked from his lungs. The next thing he knew, he was on the floor, surrounded by hushed, panicked faces, a cold compress on his forehead. It wasn't a heart attack, the emergency room doctor told him later, his voice clipped, grave. It's exhaustion, Mr. Hayes. Severe burnout. Your body just shut down. You're running on fumes, and those fumes are toxic. You keep this up, and next time it won't be a warning. The doctor's words were a cold slap, but it was a quiet evening a few days later that truly shattered the carefully constructed facade of his life. He was home, confined to the couch, a glass of water his only companion, the corporate laptop forbidden. From the living room, he watched Emily, then barely a teenager, meticulously helping Michael, a rambunctious 7-year-old, build a towering fort out of sofa cushions and blankets. The soft lamplight cast a warm glow on their faces, illuminating the utter, uncomplicated joy of their shared project. Michael shrieked with delight as the fort briefly stood, only to collapse in a heap of fabric and laughter. Emily, patient and kind, immediately started helping him rebuild, her hand gently guiding his. He watched them, a stranger in his own home, observing a beautiful, vibrant life unfolding without him, a life he had been too busy to notice. He saw the unadulterated connection, the simple purpose in their collaboration, the genuine contribution of one sibling to another's happiness. And in that moment, the entire elaborate edifice of his ambition crumbled. The monumental promotion, the corner office, the fat bonuses, they all appeared as hollow, glittering promises. Fortune and fame were empty vessels, incapable of holding the kind of pure, radiant wealth he was witnessing right there on his own living room floor. He saw the truth, stark and undeniable. True wealth wasn't measured in digits in a bank account or titles on a business card. It resided in these quiet, unglamorous moments, in the shared laughter, the gentle touch, the simple act of building something, anything, together. It was in connection. It was in simple purpose. It was in genuine contribution. He had chased a ghost, and the pursuit had nearly cost him everything real. That night, Lester found himself wide awake at 3 a.m. The house was utterly silent, a heavy, suffocating quiet that amplified every thud of his own heart. He lay in the sprawling, king-sized bed, too big for one man, too luxurious for the emptiness it contained. The pale moonlight sliced through the expensive blinds, laying strips of silver across the designer carpet. He sat up, his head in his hands, the doctor's warning still ringing in his ears, but it was the image of Emily and Michael that truly haunted him. His life? What had it become? A high-speed chase after a horizon that kept receding. He was a machine, finely tuned for acquisition, for conquest, for more. But for what? He'd sacrificed his sleep, his health, his very presence, for numbers on a spreadsheet and a fleeting sense of superiority. He saw himself clearly now, not as the titan he aspired to be, but as a hollowed-out shell propelled by ego and the fear of not being enough, in a world that constantly demanded more. A wave of regret, cold and sharp, washed over him. Regret for every missed bedtime story, every school play he'd sent Sarah to alone, every family dinner cut short by an urgent email. He told himself it was for them, for their future, for their security. But he knew in that brutal honesty of the pre-dawn hours that it had been for him, for his ego, for the fleeting validation of success. The ambition he'd once worn as a badge of honor now felt like a lead weight, crushing him. He'd been so proud of his relentless drive, his ability to outwork anyone in the room. Now he saw it as a desperate, pathetic scramble, a refusal to see the actual riches laid at his feet every single day. He was overly critical of his former self, yes, but it was a necessary cruelty, a scalpel cutting away the rotten parts to see what, if anything, remained. The shame burned, a deep, persistent ache. He was a rich man, a successful man, and he was profoundly, utterly, miserably poor. The gray light of dawn was finally creeping through the blinds, painting the edges of the room in hues of bruised purple and weak silver. He hadn't slept a wink, not a single true moment of rest. But the frantic energy that usually accompanied his sleepless nights, the anxious plotting and strategizing, the endless churn of the corporate grinder in his mind, it was all gone. Replaced by a profound, unsettling, yet strangely comforting stillness. It felt like the eye of a hurricane, silent and clear after years of being buffeted by the storm. He watched Sarah stir beside him, her breathing soft and even, a picture of peaceful slumber. His gaze drifted to the framed photos on her bedside table. Emily's graduation grin, Michael's shy smile from last Christmas. A wave of protectiveness, pure and unadulterated, washed over him. This, he realized, was the wealth, this quiet, breathing presence, not the numbers on a spreadsheet, not the stock options, not the fleeting hollow validation of a big title, this fragile, precious, utterly real connection. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, a silent vow had been made, forged in the crucible of that long, dark night. Enough, just enough. The word resonated deep in his bones, not as surrender, but as a reclaiming, a liberation. He had spent so long chasing an ever-receding horizon, believing that happiness lay just over the next hill, beyond the next promotion, wrapped up in the next six-figure bonus. Now he saw the truth. The real gold had been lying at his feet the whole time, overlooked, kicked aside in his desperate scramble for fool's gold. He didn't know what came next, didn't have a plan, not really. All he knew, with a certainty that chilled and warmed him simultaneously, was that this couldn't continue. Chase was over. The relentless ambition, the sterile climb, the quiet erosion of his soul, he was done. The following Monday felt like a performance, a morbid play in which he was the lead actor, delivering his final, unconvincing lines. He walked into his pristine corner office, the one with the panoramic view of the city's concrete canyons, and felt nothing but detachment. The polished mahogany desk, the ergonomic chair, the hushed reverence of his assistant, it all seemed like props. Empty, meaningless adornments in a life he no longer recognized as his own. He was a ghost haunting his own success. His resignation, when he delivered it, was met with stunned silence, then disbelief, then a thinly veiled contempt from his boss, a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in the very pursuit Lester was abandoning. "Lester, what in God's name are you talking about?" Mr. Henderson had bellowed, his face purpling. A managing director position is practically yours. The Global Accounts Project. Your baby. You're walking away from a fortune. They tried to appeal to his ambition, his loyalty, even his family's supposed needs. Think about your children, Lester. Emily's student loans, Michael's future. You're throwing away security, prestige, everything you've worked for. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, almost unnervingly so. It was not the voice of the frantic, driven executive they knew, but something steadier, deeper. I am thinking about their future, Mr. Henderson, and mine. He offered no further explanation, no grand soliloquy. The truth was too simple, too raw to be distilled into corporate jargon. The conversation with Sarah was harder, far more agonizing than facing down his bewildered boss. She listened, her brow furrowed with concern, her initial shock giving way to a flicker of understanding that touched him deeply. She knew him, knew the hollow man he'd become, even if she hadn't dared to name it. "Are you sure, Lester?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, her eyes searching his. "This isn't just a phase, a reaction to the burnout." The worry in her voice was palpable, a genuine fear for their financial future, for their stability. He met her gaze, his own eyes unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Sarah." He took her hands, holding them tightly. I was dying. Not just my body, my spirit. I was chasing something that didn't exist, and I was losing us in the process. Losing me." He explained simply the emptiness, the quiet despair he'd felt, the realization during that sleepless night. He told her about the children, about the precious, irreplaceable moments he'd missed. She saw the truth in his eyes, the profound certainty that had replaced the restless ambition. Her hand found his across the kitchen table, a silent, powerful affirmation. "Then we'll figure it out," she'd whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "We always do. Finding the factory job wasn't quick or easy." He, Lester Harding, a man who once commanded quarterly reports and multi-million-dollar deals, was now filling out applications for entry-level positions. He deliberately sought out honest, physical work, the kind where you left with sweat on your brow and actual sawdust on your boots. He needed to feel the tangible impact of his labor to create something real, something he could touch instead of manipulating abstract figures. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor the significant pay cut that came with it. It was a plunge, a freefall from the dizzying, lonely heights of perceived success, a deliberate shedding of a skin that no longer fit. His first day at the plant, the old Miller & Sons machining facility, felt like walking onto a different planet. The clang of metal on metal, the pervasive smell of oil and grit, the roar of machinery. It was a deafening symphony of labor he'd only ever glimpsed from the air-conditioned bubble of his tinted car windows. His hands, once accustomed to tapping on touchscreens and shaking other powerful hands, felt alien holding a heavy wrench, learning the precise, repetitive movements required for the hydraulic press. He was older than most of the new hires, a former executive now taking orders from a foreman half his age, a gruff but fair man named Pete. His back ached before noon. His muscles, long softened by ergonomic office chairs and expense account lunches, protested with every lift, every turn, every shift of his weight. The sheer physical exertion was a shock to his system, a brutal reintroduction to the real world he'd consciously avoided for decades. He almost didn't make it through that first shift. The little voice, the one that used to whisper about ambition and status and the shame of failure, screamed at him to go back, to admit defeat, to reclaim his old life, to call Mr. Henderson, apologize, and accept whatever gilded cage they offered. But then he remembered the stillness of that pre-dawn hour, the quiet vow made in the face of his own hollow existence. He remembered Sarah's unwavering gaze and the profound, aching emptiness that had once been his constant companion. He remembered the simple, honest joy in Emily's and Michael's laughter, and he gripped the wrench tighter, forcing his protesting muscles through another repetition. This is it, he told himself, each word a hammer blow against the rising tide of doubt. This is honest. This is real. Each drop of sweat was a payment, a small offering for the peace he sought, a tangible contribution to a life he was finally building, brick by arduous brick. He wasn't chasing a horizon anymore. He was building something, one honest, arduous movement at a time. The fortune he'd once chased had vanished, replaced by the humble, tangible weight of a new, profound purpose. The second day was worse. His body, instead of adjusting, decided to protest louder, each muscle fiber screaming in a language Lester had long forgotten. He walked slower, moved with a stiffness that added years to his frame. Sarah, bless her heart, didn't say much at dinner, just watched him with those knowing eyes of hers. the kind that saw past the gruff exterior to the weariness beneath. He'd barely made it through the evening before collapsing into bed, dreaming of spreadsheets and air conditioning, then waking with a jolt, the metallic tang of factory air already in his nostrils, even before the alarm blared its unwelcome greeting. By the end of the first week, a grim rhythm had begun to assert itself. He still woke before the alarm, but now it wasn't from anticipation. It was from a raw ache that permeated every joint, a persistent thrum of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fully dispel. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused, perpetually grimy, and dotted with small nicks and cuts. He'd burned through a pot of coffee before heading out, the dark liquid a temporary truce against the physical demands that awaited him. The monotony of the line, the endless repetition of tasks, began to wear on him in a different way than the office ever had. Before, his mind had been overstimulated, racing with projections and deadlines. Now it was understimulated, left to wander into dangerous territory. The old voices started to creep back in. "What are you doing, Lester? Look at you. You had it all. A corner office. A name. Respect." He'd catch glimpses of himself in the darkened windows of the factory at lunch, a man covered in dust, sweat, and what felt like the residue of failure. He saw the tired lines around his eyes, the perpetual slump of his shoulders, and the sharp, critical gaze of his former self would stab him in the gut. He'd remember the lavish dinners, the company car, the ease with which he could provide anything his family desired. He could have been Mr. Henderson. He could have been the boss. Instead, he was just Lester, number 73 on the line. One particularly grueling Tuesday, just 2 weeks into his new life, the temptation nearly overwhelmed him. The hydraulic press, a behemoth of steel and noise, jammed. A chain reaction stalled the entire line. The foreman, a burly man named Gus with a voice like gravel, was bellowing orders, his face a thundercloud. Lester, already at the breaking point of exhaustion, fumbled with a heavy wrench, his mind a fog of fatigue. His back flared with pain, a sharp, searing protest. He dropped the tool with a clang that seemed to echo the frustration building inside him. "You all right there, Lester?" Gus asked, his tone surprisingly devoid of anger, though his eyes were sharp. Lester just nodded, unable to trust his voice. All he wanted to do was walk away. Out the door, into his car, and drive until he found a world where he didn't have to lift another heavy object, where his brain was valued more than his brawn. He thought of his old colleague, Henderson, probably sipping single malt whiskey, closing a deal that would make millions, while Lester was covered in grease, wrestling with a stubborn piece of machinery. The shame, hot and bitter, washed over him. He felt like a fool. He felt like a failure. He spent the rest of the shift in a haze, the self-doubt a constant drone in his head. When the whistle finally blew, signaling the end of his workday, he walked out into the cool evening air, the industrial smells clinging to his clothes. He didn't head straight to his car. Instead, he found a solitary bench near the employee entrance, tucked away behind a rusted dumpster, and sat down heavily. He didn't know what to do. His body was broken, his spirit was bruised, and the quiet peace he'd sought felt impossibly distant, replaced by a fresh kind of misery. Maybe he'd made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Sarah's number. He wanted to confess, to admit he couldn't do it, that he was too weak, too soft, too much of the man he used to be. But as his finger trembled, he saw his reflection in the dark screen, smudged with dirt, yes, but also a quiet defiance in his eyes, a stubborn refusal to break. And then he remembered the image of Emily, curled up on the couch reading, Michael sketching at the kitchen table, their faces peaceful, unaware of the corporate shark their father had been, the hollowness he'd carried. He remembered the quiet vow, the realization that true wealth wasn't in the numbers on a screen, but in the quiet, living moments he'd been missing. He wasn't just working a job, he was building a life, brick by arduous brick, just as he'd told himself. He was building himself. And that, he realized, was worth more than any corner office or gilded cage. He pocketed the phone, stood up, and squared his aching shoulders. He had to keep going. Not for the money, not for the fame, but for the quiet satisfaction of proving to himself that he could choose differently, that he could be different. And so he kept going. He had to. The early mornings didn't get easier, not exactly, but something else shifted. Around day 20, maybe day 25, Lester stopped fighting the rhythm of the machines and started moving with it. His muscles still screamed, but the screams became a familiar hum, a language he was slowly learning. He found a certain satisfaction in the repetitive motion, the careful alignment of parts, the precision required to keep the line moving. It wasn't the kind of intellectual challenge he'd once thrived on, but it was a challenge of a different sort, of endurance, of focus. And surprisingly, it cleared his head in a way that spreadsheets and board meetings never had. One afternoon, he caught himself humming along to a terrible pop song blaring from someone's radio. He hadn't hummed at work in years. He glanced around, self-conscious, but no one seemed to notice. A few days later, old Frank, the grizzled lead on his section who mostly communicated in grunts and head nods, actually offered him a half-smile when Lester quickly fixed a jammed mechanism. "Figured it out, huh?" Frank muttered, and it felt like a medal. Lester nodded, a quiet sense of accomplishment settling in his chest. It was a small thing, almost invisible, but it was real. At home, Sarah started to notice too. He still came home tired, but the grim set to his jaw had softened. He listened more, truly listened, when Emily talked about her nursing classes or Michael detailed his latest coding project. Instead of mentally reviewing his day's failures or planning tomorrow's corporate maneuvers, his mind was often just present. One evening, Michael asked him for help fixing a wobbly leg on his desk. Lester, without a second thought, went to the garage, got his tools, and spent a focused hour making it right. The satisfaction wasn't in delegating the task or reviewing a project report. It was in the tangible feel of the wood, the solid thunk of the hammer, the quiet, "Thanks, Dad," from his son. These moments, small and unassuming, began to accumulate like pebbles in a stream, slowly redirecting the flow of his days. He started his volunteer shift at the youth center with a knot of anxiety, unsure how a man who built car parts could connect with restless teenagers. But he found himself drawn to the sheer, unbridled energy in the place. He listened to their stories, helped a kid struggling with a broken bicycle chain, showed another how to hold a screwdriver properly. He found a quiet pride in showing them something real, something they could use. He didn't offer advice about career paths or market trends. He offered presence, patience, and the practical knowledge of a man who worked with his hands. And in return, he saw their hesitant trust, the flicker of interest in their eyes. He realized the impact wasn't about grand gestures or corporate sponsorships. It was about showing up consistently and genuinely caring. Hope began to bloom, a tenacious weed pushing through cracked concrete, promising a different kind of harvest. Weeks bled into months. The factory floor, once a symbol of his downfall, had become his proving ground. He was still Lester, still a man of quiet strength and deliberate words, but the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a subtle, steady light. He still had gruff moments, a dry wit that could catch people off guard, but now there was a warmth underneath it, a genuine interest in the people around him. He knew the names of his coworkers' kids, offered a quiet word of support when someone was having a tough day, and occasionally brought in donuts on a Friday. He became less of an outsider and more of a quiet fixture, a reliable hand, someone you could count on. His home reflected this transformation too. The small house, always tidy, now hummed with a different energy. He and Sarah would sit on the porch in the evenings, not talking about bills or ambitions, but about their day, their children, the quiet unfolding of their lives. He learned to bake bread with Sarah, the smell of yeast and warmth filling the kitchen, a stark contrast to the sterile corporate cafeterias he'd once frequented. He spent weekends helping Michael with a woodworking project, teaching him the patience and precision that factory work had instilled in him. He watched Emily flourish in her demanding nursing career, her compassion mirroring the quiet empathy he now allowed himself to express. He wasn't just observing his family, he was participating, a vital, integrated part of their fabric. At the youth center, Lester became Mr. Lester, the guy who could fix anything, the one who listened without judgment. He organized a small workshop, teaching kids basic carpentry and mechanics, watching their faces light up as they built something with their own hands. The regret he once carried, that heavy burden of what might have been, had not vanished entirely, but it had shrunk, replaced by a profound, undeniable sense of peace. He wasn't making headlines or breaking sales records, but he was building something far more enduring: connection, purpose, and a life rich in meaning. He was truly a new man. He saw the world with new eyes, not through the lens of profit margins and quarterly reports, but through the vibrant, messy, beautiful reality of shared humanity. He felt a profound sense of contentment, a quiet joy that surpassed any fleeting triumph of his previous existence. He was richer than he could have ever imagined. The quiet transformation, though subtle at first, began to radiate outwards. At the factory on the floor, the shift boss, an old-timer named Frank with eyes that missed nothing, started noticing. It wasn't that Lester was suddenly loud or boisterous. That wasn't his way. But there was a lightness in his step, a new, almost imperceptible tilt to his chin. The gruff edge that had once been a wall around him began to soften. One Tuesday, the assembly line jammed, a finicky pneumatic arm seizing up. The air filled with curses and the clatter of dropped tools. Lester, instead of his usual silent assessment, walked over, tool in hand, and with a focused hum, coaxed the mechanism back to life. As he tightened the last bolt, he looked up at Frank, a genuine, wry smile creasing his eyes. "Sometimes," he said, wiping grease on a rag, "you just gotta whisper to 'em." Frank just nodded, a knowing glint in his own tired eyes. He'd seen men change for the worse in that factory, seen the grind wear them down to nothing. But Lester, he was different. He was somehow growing. He'd seen the despair fade from a man before, but rarely the kind of quiet, deep-rooted joy Lester now carried like a well-worn coat. Weeks melted into months. Lester's home, once a pit stop between ambitions, became the sanctuary he had always yearned for. Evenings weren't about catching up on emails or strategizing for the next quarter. They were about the slow, comforting rhythm of family. One night, while Sarah hummed softly as she folded laundry, Lester sat at the kitchen table, helping Michael untangle a particularly stubborn calculus problem. The equations blurred on the page, but Lester wasn't just seeing numbers. He was seeing his son's determined brow, the slight furrow of concentration that mirrored his own. He paused, watching Michael scratch his head, and a quiet wave of affection washed over him, so potent it made his chest ache in the best possible way. He didn't offer the answer directly, but guided him with patient, thoughtful questions, the way a good mentor should. Later, as the house grew quiet, he found Sarah in the living room, a book open on her lap. He sat beside her, not saying a word, just taking her hand. Her fingers, roughened by years of honest work and gentle care, felt like the most precious thing in the world. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, a silent testament to a love that had weathered storms and emerged, finally, fully seen. At the youth center, his workshop grew. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It became a place where kids, some from rough homes, could find a steady hand and a listening ear. Lester taught them how to sand a piece of wood until it was silky smooth, how to use a saw with respect, how to measure twice and cut once. But more than that, he taught them about the satisfaction of honest effort, of seeing something take shape under their own hands. He often told them, his voice low and steady, "You see that grain in the wood? Every knot, every swirl, that's its story. You can either try to force it, or you can work with it, make something beautiful out of what's already there." He saw flashes of his younger, driven self in some of their hungry eyes, the boys who wanted to skip steps, who were impatient for the finish line. He'd just smile, a little sadly, a little wisely. "Slow down," he'd say. "The real richness is in the making." He carried no fancy title, drew no executive salary, but Lester felt a wealth so profound it made his previous ambitions seem like child's play. The old regret, the gnawing question of, "What if?" was finally quiet. It wasn't just peace, it was joy. The kind that settled deep in your bones after a long, honest day, knowing you de-spent your hours on what truly mattered. He no longer saw the world through the narrow lens of personal gain or corporate ladder rungs. He saw the intricate patterns in a freshly planed piece of wood, the flicker of understanding in a young boy's eyes, the comfortable sag of the couch beside his wife. He was, in every meaningful way, a truly rich man. He often thought about it late at night, the hum of the old refrigerator a comforting drone in the quiet house. Used to think rich meant fancy cars, big houses, and titles nobody could pronounce. Turns out it's about what you build with your hands, the honest sweat you put in, and who you share your time with. The real gold, he understood now, ain't in the bank vault or in a stock portfolio. It's in the good you do, the lives you touch, and the quiet nights with family when you know you belong. He wouldn't trade that for all the corner offices in the world, not for a single fleeting moment. And so, the man who once chased the horizon for gold found it right beneath his feet. He discovered that